Not getting enough protein is the number one fear Americans have about their diets, according to new research. And protein is the number one characteristic American consumers use to define a healthy food.
We don't eat enough protein, and there's science to prove this, and eating enough protein will change your life and change the game.
We basically tell people, aim for 1 gram per pound, which would be 2.2 grams per kilo.
There's a tremendous amount of emerging science that talks about the need for more protein in our diet.
America is definitely obsessed with protein, but here's the thing. While we lead the world in science and tech, health is not our claim to fame. For example, this chart of obesity trends in countries similar to ours is not a good look for America. The good news is some countries like France and Spain are clearly showing it's possible to bend the obesity curve downward. Curiously, both the US and Australia are protein obsessed, although Oz is far less so. But it's not really a thing in Spain or France. For example, according to the market research reports I read, the market size for protein bars and supplements in the US is $10 billion, where it's just $0.1 billion in Spain. France and Spain famously bent their obesity curves downward by teaching nutrition in schools. I made an episode about Japan's program, but nutrition education in schools is not a thing in America. This is what they teach children to eat in Spain. It's the Mediterranean diet where half the plate is fruit and vegetables. The Nordic countries and Japan put a cap on protein in their dietary guidelines. They recommend an upper limit on children's consumption at 15% of calories and 20% for adults. The thing is, everything in public health is multifactorial. There's the healthcare system, there's the culture, there's the financial income, etc. Public health scientists often score those factors according to their impact. Some people believe the highest scoring factor for American obesity is our love of processed food.
Honey?
The argument we often hear is protein is satiating, so drinking a protein shake means we can lose some other stuff off the plate. But the fear among nutritionists is that protein shakes are so yummy that in trying to hit our protein targets, we end up consuming more calories. There's also the fear that adding protein to food that looks a lot like candy bars tricks us into thinking it's healthy. In my Costco, protein bars take up an entire row. Does adding protein to Reese's peanut butter cups make them healthy? If I thought so, then I would race up the obesity curve. I have been obsessed with various versions of this chart for years. We really do stand alone in the world in terms of life expectancy versus healthcare costs. We live 5 or 6 years less than healthy countries and spend twice as much on healthcare. The most obvious explanation is we have for-profit healthcare, and in other countries, healthcare is public, like our fire departments. For years, I leaned into for-profit healthcare as probably the biggest factor because we have middlemen who skim money and deny care. I even invited an emergency room physician who has worked in both Australia and the US to give a TEDx talk to make that case. But one of the things that I could not reconcile is that Asian Americans live 7 years longer than white Americans and only have a 16% obesity rate. They live with the same healthcare system we do. That's also true for Adventists who are quite racially diverse. Market research indicates that neither group has a supplement culture like white Americans do. And is it really fair to blame the obesity crisis on our healthcare system? I don't think so. As I was reading market research about the protein market in America, one thing jumped out at me. Social media influencers have become the new authorities in the world of health and wellness. They have unbelievable power to sway consumer behavior and drive sales. And the thing that really jumps out is how that influence is concentrated in the hands of a small number of mega influencers in America. Here are 8 of the biggest, judging by a combination of their own channels and their appearances on other mega channels. None of them actually conduct scientific research, and all of them make wild science-denying claims. I've covered many of those claims in previous episodes. For example, Peter Attia claims in his mega best-selling book that protein recommendations from scientists and medical associations around the world are a joke, and you should more than double them. He wrote that if you eat excess protein, you'll simply pee out the excess. No scientist would back that claim. I could expand my list of influencers to the people who seem to be the top 50 most influential personalities in nutrition in America, and you still wouldn't find an actual nutrition scientist. So I have come to believe that the number one factor for why Americans stand alone in poor health despite spending the most is lack of trust in scientists and institutions. It is both a symptom and a cause. Claims don't get bolder than that. Let's see if I can back that up. I have 4 points. Number 1, when we interviewed Eva Rustedt de Brises from Norway about their dietary guidelines, she said something we didn't think to ask.
This may be a bit surprising to you, but in Norway, about 7 out of 10 people, they trust the dietary guidelines from the national health authorities. And maybe, I don't know, but maybe that is because we are relatively boring and stable with our guidelines and do not follow every trend that comes along the way.
Boring and stable.
That's a speculation. We follow the scientific advice that we are sure are the best at the time.
What a ginormous difference in how Americans view our guidelines. Influencers have produced too many videos to count about how we think the guidelines are an evil scam. And yet, the inspiration for our guidelines came from Sweden. Our 2025 guideline proposal, written by actual nutrition scientists, looks just like the guidelines from every other healthy country. But we stand alone in rejecting that science because an influencer with no background in science is now in charge of America's health. I really dislike saying this, but the inmates have overrun the asylum.
Some of the non-administration figures in that video are Maha moms and influencers who played a big role in spreading this movement. Some have even been invited to the White House, like this influencer back in May.
So I am in D.C. for the big announcement of the MAHA Chronic Disease Report, and I'm in podcasting. I podcast with Bobby Kennedy. Everybody's in this room podcasting. I'm eating raw milk, raw meat, grass-fed beef in the White House.
That guy even got RFK to do a raw milk shot on camera, making raw milk one of the most disgusting things floating around in RFK at any given time, right up there with that dead worm in his brain.
You'll meet an actual nutrition scientist here in a few minutes who helped write the 2025 proposed guidelines for America. I'll ask about protein, and you can judge whether he's an evil scammer. Number 2, as I was growing up, Ancel Keys was one of the most admired scientists in America. He still is among nutrition scientists around the world. And the Mediterranean diet that his large international team of scientists promoted has become the gold standard for Western countries. But 2 journalists who became nutrition influencers, Nina Teicholz and Gary Taubes, became famous for debunking Ancel Keys. And to do that, they simply made things up. And then several social media doctors like Mark Hyman ran with it. For example, they claimed he cherry-picked the countries his team studied. I made a short clip about that, and I have never heard even the most hardcore Ancel Keys conspiracist watch it and still believe they cherry-picked. And that's because they didn't, and we have the receipts. Once scientists are pushed aside, it opens the door to every good-looking, charismatic profiteer to promote every extreme diet imaginable. And those diets come and go, just like fashion. But I'm not aware of any of them unless they're a close cousin to the Mediterranean diet, like Nordic and Asian diets are, that have been effective in public health. Number 3, I got fascinated in the COVID vaccination data that the CDC was publishing, and I noticed a huge difference in the vaccination rates of Asian Americans versus other ethnicities. In the high mortality states in the South, where vaccine hesitancy was high, the Asian vaccination rates stood out, often 95% or higher, whereas white vaccination rates were usually 50-something%. And the resulting death rate for Asians was 30% lower, even though they have added risk factors such as more often living in multi-generational housing. The CDC attributed the lower death rates to Asians having more trust in science and institutions. Number 4, trust in science in America has gone south generally. The current NASA administrator has no scientific background. There is only one scientist in the U.S. House, none in the Senate, and none in the Cabinet. In contrast, the President of Mexico, who has a 75% approval rating, is a PhD energy and climate scientist, author of 100 papers, 2 books, and contributor to the 2007 IPCC report that was awarded a Nobel Prize. Canada has many engineers and scientists as politicians and even a PhD in economics as Prime Minister. The nation that has long prided itself in leading the world in science and having the best universities has now turned against both of them. We want to destroy perfectly good paid-for satellites that are collecting data on CO2 emissions and encourage people to eat French fries cooked in beef tallow. Only social media influencers could support those decisions. We now stand alone in the world as the standouts in science denial. But we still have great scientists. Let's go meet one and talk protein.
So as if nutrition science wasn't controversial enough, you flew into the eye of the storm and decided to focus on protein.
I did.
The gym bros are coming for you. Why'd you do it?
That's Christopher Gardner, nutrition science professor from Stanford. You may recognize him from the Netflix special, You Are What You Eat, that got so much attention because it featured identical twins. It was a mixture of Christopher's science and Netflix's creativity, and some of that creativity took Christopher by surprise. Internet influencers lost their minds over that special, partly because of Netflix's creativity, which they falsely attributed to Christopher. But I think it was partly emotional because nutrition science points towards more European-style eating, while most popular American influencers want us to become red meat nation. One fear they have is when they see the unprepared foods in dietary guidelines for countries like Spain, they're not thinking delicious. But I think, as everyone knows, the Italians, French, and Spanish love their food because it is delicious. And Americans do too when they travel there.
Spectacular.
And by any measure, their dietary guidelines are working. And that's one of the things I love about Christopher. He's all about deliciousness.
I did it because of the menus of change. When we started this thing with the Culinary Institute of America, we had a group of scientists and chefs and business people put together this program that was really designed for chefs. And it was chefs being very frustrated that they were being reactive. It was gluten one day and then vegan and then paleo and keto, and they kept changing their menus and they kept changing some of their equipment. They said, oh my God, can't we just get ahead of this instead of being so reactive? Couldn't we be proactive? What happened? Pizza got out. So they wanted to be more proactive as chefs. And they said, aren't there some things that aren't gonna go away? And this group that I had the honor to be involved with created the 24 principles of the menus of change. And it's posted online. Anybody can find it. 12 of them are actually nutritional principles. And 12 of them are operational. Celebrate diversity, be seasonal when you can, things like that. And at one point they were trying to put as many of those principles together into single concepts as they could. And one was the protein flip. And the protein flip actually evolved from the dessert flip. So the Culinary Institute of America had been asked to take desserts and could you possibly help us out here because we get a hard time with all the sugar and everything. And they said, oh, we got a big piece of cheesecake with a raspberry on top. Let's have a big bowl of raspberries with a dollop of cheesecake on top. We didn't take your cheesecake away. We flipped it. And so they decided to do the same thing with protein. And they said, the protein flip, if we put plants in the middle of the plate and celebrated the vegetables and the grains and the things like that, could that be done? And so meat would be a small serving on top or a condiment or a side dish. And as they worked on this protein flip, they said, oh, we have an annual meeting. Why don't you do a talk on protein in case anybody's worried about the protein? And I said, sure, how long do I get? And they said, 8 minutes. And I said, eight minutes? Like I teach nutrition science to Stanford undergrads and I get two 2-hour sessions with them, 8 minutes. Okay. 8 minutes. How could I do this in the fastest way possible? And so what I did is, for the first time, and I had never done this before, I really looked deeply into the amino acids of different foods, and I started making graphs of how many amino acids, none are missing, they're all there in all plant foods.
I know how to push your buttons.
Okay.
Quinoa is the only one, or maybe soy, that has all the amino acids, right?
Yeah, my favorite is quinoa, the only plant food that has all 9 essential amino acids. Bullshit, I have a graph. I published it, and I've shown it widely and wildly, and all the foods have all 20 amino acids, including all 9 essential amino acids. But the fun was actually making a graphic out of it and showing several foods. I did it kind of in a fun way.
I'll jump in for just a minute because I made a high-res version of Christopher's chart so I can zoom in while he's explaining. It's really 2 charts in one. On the left are the essential amino acids we have to get from food, and they are in descending order of proportions as they appear in animal food. The right chart is the same, but for so-called non-essential amino acids, meaning your body can make them under normal circumstances. Dr. Gardner will take us through some protein basics, and then in the second half of this interview, some fireworks are going to go off. And then I'll see you on the other end of this interview for what I think will be a very satisfying conclusion. By the way, Viva Longevity is my expensive retirement hobby. I simply believe in the cause. I turn off all the ads YouTube will let me, and I don't take donations or sponsorships. If you'd like to help us, the best thing you can do is to like, comment, and subscribe. It means the world to us. Thanks so much.
Another important thing about amino acids is there are 20 of them, and just to be rough, just to make this overly simplistic, a lot of people probably need 40 grams of protein. And if there's 20 amino acids, you might think, 2 grams of each one to make 40. That would be simple math. And it's not true at all. So things like glutamate and aspartate, you need much more. Tryptophan and methionine, you need very little. And so I had our dietitian staff go through and give me a set of 40 different foods or so. And I sort of lined up all the animal foods and all the plant foods to look at the order, and it's quite consistent in all the animal foods. It goes from highest to lowest, and no matter if it's chicken or fish or anything, it gets lower and lower and lower. You can see how common the pattern is in all of those. And so then I said, so everybody, what do you think the plant ones look like? You know they're missing, or they have to be complemented. They must look bizarre, right? The patterns must be completely different. And I put up the pattern of rice and beans and broccoli and something else, and jaws just dropped. They said, what? I said, yeah, they're not missing, and the order is virtually identical, except for 2 little things. Grains are proportionally low in lysine, and beans are proportionally low in methionine, which you can't even pick up because the methionine is such a small proportion of the amino acids. It's really hard to see that they're in the wrong proportion because they're at the tail end anyway. And so after doing this, which was more than a decade ago, they had an annual meeting the next year, and they said, that was really good. Could you do that for 20 minutes? And then the next year they said, can you do it for an hour? And then I got invited to a sports conference in LA, and they asked me to do it for 2 hours. And I said, me and how many people? And they said, you. I said, 2 hours? And they said, yeah, can you talk for 2 hours? And I said, hell yeah, I could talk for 2 hours. And so I put together this really intense slide deck for 2 hours, and I brought in all kinds of athletic stuff into it. And so then I was on a roll. I kept getting asked. That was the menus have changed. Then there's a conference that's held in Napa every year. It's called Healthy Kitchens, Healthy Lives. And they started asking me to give a talk for the physicians. About 500 physicians come. It's half cooking and half science, which is super fun. After going for a number of years, I started thinking, really should put this in a paper. We added a whole set of facts about, well, if you look at the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, this is how much protein people report eating, and they tend to underreport, so you should probably bump that up. And we looked at USDA data on how much the Agricultural Service says we produce that's available for people. And you have to cut that back because there's food waste. Not everybody eats all the food that we produce or have available. You come to about 90 grams of protein a day for Americans. And when you put that with the recommended daily allowance, which tends to be in the 50 to 60 gram range per day per person, which has a safety buffer on it, it was built to not be the average requirement. That's actually called the estimated average requirement. If you were to think of the requirement of individuals as a normal curve, and you found the average requirement, and you suggested everybody get that, and they did, by definition, half the population would be deficient by math. And so the actual RDA is set 2 standard deviations above that on this curve. And
so that means like 2 or 3% of people are deficient?
Yeah, so if everybody got the RDA, which is about 50 to 60 grams per day, according to that, 2 or 3% would be deficient, and 97% would meet or exceed, importantly, or exceed, and they're getting 90. So in this paper, we summarized it all. We said, here's the RDA, here's how they made it. It's got a safety buffer. Americans seem to eat a much higher amount than that. And if you're worried about plants, let me show you a heat map of where all the amino acids fall. It's much more similar to animal protein than you would think. And can you all just get the F over it and stop obsessing about protein? We have much bigger issues to address in nutrition than protein.
So let me do the math here. If only 2 or 3% are deficient if they got the 60 grams, but with 90 grams, that comes out to 0 people are deficient.
How about that? Yeah.
0.
And it's funny because at these conferences, as I was giving these talks, and I'd have 500 physicians in front of me, I'd say, every year I'd say, just out of curiosity, how many of you have vegetarians and vegans in your practice that you see? And pretty much everybody's hand went up. I have some. I said, how many of you have ever treated anyone for protein deficiency in your entire career? And nobody's hands goes up.
Have you ever seen a hand go up?
No, but the funny thing is, in the front row, the people in the front row think, well, I didn't, but surely somebody behind. No one behind me? No one's hand is up?
No one's ever seen it.
And then I just started going on this rant about, please stop obsessing
about protein.
About protein. There's so many other more important issues.
Yeah, but what about people who have sarcopenia? They're frail, they're aging.
So there is an important issue about older folks. It's multifactorial. There's hormonal issues, there's dentiture issues, there's loneliness, there's depression, there's a lack of enjoyment of the food. There are a lot of things going on. And yes, they probably need more than the average adult. So I have seen numbers thrown around. So the recommended daily allowance is 0.8 grams per kilogram per day. And it's been proposed that for older adults that be bumped up 25% to 1 gram per kilogram per day. But a group of scientists pulled all the protein data together since 2005 and wrote a massive report that was released in November of 2024. It's online. I was asked to be a reviewer for this. And as I went through it, they went through the protein recommendations, different age categories, and every single amino acid. And the main conclusion is they don't have the data to increase it. There aren't enough data to suggest that it should change. In my mind, there's 2 other levels you could go to look at this. And the simplest one is, are you maintaining, building, or losing muscle mass? So a lot of people don't want to just be minimum. They'd like to be optimal. And most people that I know are not building muscle. They're trying to maintain muscle. They might build it for a while, but you can't continue to build muscle forever. So at some point, pretty soon, your goal will be to maintain it. For sarcopenia, you'd want to maintain your muscle mass. We actually have no place to store protein in our body for the next day. We have an infinite capacity to store fat for the next day and the next and the next and the next. We have a very limited capacity to store carbohydrate. If you're a marathon runner, you would know that you can store enough.
I am, and I know.
Carbs in your liver and your muscles for 20 miles and then you bonk, because in 4 hours you could exhaust your entire carbohydrate storage. But for protein, if you ate more than you needed today for your muscles, enzymes, hormones, fingernails, hair, there isn't a place to store it. So you break the nitrogen off and you turn it into carbohydrates. And if you have too much carbohydrate, you turn that into fat. So there's no place to store it. If you are deficient in protein, what would you do And so the human body's reaction to this is, okay, well, I really need my heart muscle and I really need my lung and my other muscles. But you know, that bicep, that quadricep, not so much. So technically, that's kind of a storage depot, but it's a functional storage depot. So that if you were deficient in protein, you would be weaker. The first thing you would do is you would catabolize your skeletal muscle. So in my mind, why don't you just see if you've lost strength? So I know people are very interested.
Cross-sectional area?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things you could do about strength or size of muscle. And a lot of the studies are done to see if you could build muscle. The next step would be to see, did you lose muscle? And that wouldn't be that hard to measure if you're doing reps of things. In fact, we've done it. We've published one study. We've submitted a second study. They weren't great studies. They were done for free with graduate students and Stanford students and dining halls. So we're actually planning another one. But we did have 24 graduate students, 12 runners, and 12 weightlifters go vegan for 4 weeks, omnivore for 4 weeks, and vegan plus the plant-based alternative meats for 4 weeks. And we tested their RPE, their relative perceived exertion, like how hard are you trying? And they were trying just as hard for all the 4-week sessions. And they lifted just as much and they ran just as fast. The last one is optimal. I don't want to have a heart attack. I don't want to die of cancer. I don't want to die of other things. You can't possibly do the definitive randomized trial where you say, okay, Chris, you eat meat for the rest of your life, and Christopher, you go vegan for the rest of your life, and we'll randomly assign you. And please don't sway. Once we've assigned you, you just have to stay that way till you die. So that will never happen. And so for that, we have to rely on observational epidemiology, which has its limitations because no one's randomized, there's confounders, but the folks who are really good at this try to adjust for all the confounders. Protein tends to not be associated with lifespan, but animal versus plant does. So quite a few papers have been published recently to say there's no association with total protein, but with more plant protein, you live longer and you have fewer.
Why is that? Do we have a mechanism? Is it like methionine or something? Sulfur-containing amino acids?
Well, so the very hard thing to tease apart is if you had more plant protein, you also had more fiber, less saturated fat, and you can try to account for all those things in your mathematics. And it's possible, but there's still probably what's called residual confounding. What else were you getting with those plants? You were getting some antioxidants that we don't even know how to measure. You were getting some other things. So it's more of a way of eating. It would be very hard to attribute it to the protein solely, or to your point,
I see.
The methionine. There is a group that says, yes, actually the methionine is a problem. And so if you had less methionine, and actually methionine a little low in beans. So people say, that's why the bean eaters do better, because it's a little low in methionine. And the muscle builders say, oh my God, if I don't get enough methionine, I won't be able to build muscle. And so there's definitely some tension between the mTOR, fractional synthetic rate muscle builder folks, and the observational epidemiology folks that say, well, I don't want to just get stronger, I want to live longer and live healthier. So there's some tension there, and it would be very hard to resolve because those are two different populations and two different outcomes, and probably won't be resolved anytime soon, but they're both out there making points that are interesting to consider.
But what matters is you live longer and have less chronic disease, right, if you're focused on plant proteins.
Yeah, so if you're looking at the general population, they're not muscle builders. They're not competing for body composition. They want to live longer, healthier life. So consistent with American Heart Association, dietary guidelines, diabetes, cancer, World Health Organization.
The Kidney Organization.
Yeah, and global, so domestic and global, they're all pushing for a more plant-based diet these days.
There's a runaway bestseller, you know Peter Attia, his book Outlive. He has some provocative quotes in there. When you talk about not being able to store protein, he says right in the book that if you eat more protein than can be converted to lean muscle mass, you just pee it out as urea. True or false?
It's not that you just pee it out. So you would pee out the nitrogen. All the amino acids have a carbon skeleton and some nitrogen. So what you'll do is you'll take the nitrogen off, and then you can use the carbon skeleton for carbs. You break off the nitrogen, turn that to ammonia in your liver, and then excrete it in your kidney.
Does the ammonia get in your sweat? And the reason that I asked this is I decided to do an Ironman when I was 50 years old, and then I got hooked on it, and I did it for a lot of years. And the coach for the class I took on training for Ironman, Joe Friel, considered himself an expert in nutrition. The paleo diet was really popular in the day. So you had to have protein. You had to get up around 2 grams per kilogram of body weight, protein-wise. Those of us who did it, I did it for a year, those of us who did it all smell like pneumonia. Our clothes smelled like pneumonia. Am I just imagining it?
I think people sweat in different ways, but yes, it would make sense that you could eliminate some of it that way.
So then I got the food calculators, and I started looking at how many hours I was working out and how many calories I was eating and all that. 3 grams per kilogram. That's endurance athletes get above 2 because you're light, so there's not a lot of kilograms. You're eating a lot of calories, and a lot of the world's best triathletes in the age were vegans. So I started eating plants, and it could be just my imagination, but I didn't remember smelling like ammonia anymore.
Aha, yeah. And for me, that was interesting. So at the time that I was doing a lot of this work, it was pretty fun because I had a teaching assistant for my nutrition class that was on the Rose Bowl Stanford football team maybe 15 years ago. Yeah. And he was a lot of fun. He joined the class taking a lot of supplements, and he started listening to what I was saying, and he started eliminating a lot of supplements and getting rid of them and tracking his diet. And he pretty much cleaned up his diet, still went and worked out. One of our assignments was to track your diet for a few days and see how many calories and how much protein you were getting. And at that point, he wasn't taking protein powders, and he wasn't doing a lot of other things. And he got 250 grams of protein because he was getting 5,000 and 6,000 calories
That's what I was eating.
Day because of his workout.
Yeah.
He was eating
it just comes naturally.
much
Yeah.
food that there wasn't really any way to do this. And I have a funny story to tell of a job talk from a nephrologist that came to Stanford one time. And he was pointing out that...
Nephrologist is a kidney doctor.
The kidney doctor, and in chronic kidney disease for a long time, one dietary approach to this was to minimize excess protein, because if you do have to get rid of the nitrogen as ammonia, it was considered to be exacerbating the challenge of the kidney to eliminate that. Most doctors get no training in nutrition, so let's remember that part. So as he was giving the talk, he said, well, we tried to get them on a low protein diet, and the goal was 0.7 grams per kilogram per day. So let's pause for a minute, because 0.7 is pretty close to 0.8.
Good luck with that.
Right? And he said, as much as we tried, we couldn't get them to 0.7. We coached them, we counseled them. It was a goal. We tried to get this, but it was too hard to get Americans to get down to 0.7 grams per kilogram per day. And I was in the back of the room almost laughing, thinking, oh my God, you can't get people to eat as low as the RDA, because the natural diet really just has more than that. So to me, it's also been kind of odd that I, at one point, had a little bit of a Twitter exchange with Stu Phillips, who's got set up at one point and said, oh my God, Phillips and Gardner should have a debate. And so
I watched that debate.
Twitter aside, I said, there's not many characters here. Can we get over the 0.8 part and just say, it's pretty hard to eat 0.8? Aren't people getting like twice that, or 1.2, like 50% more anyway? And he said, oh yeah, well that part's true. So it's really not hard to get more than the RDA.
So Stu Phillips is an interesting character. You and he debated on video. Simon Hill hosted it.
Yes.
I watched it. You were very gentlemanly with each other, which was great. And I've read Stu's papers. I have to admit, I have a little bit of a bias. I'm a little bit suspicious because half his funding comes from the Dairy Council and VLSI and all that. But some of these papers where he measures performance versus protein intake, what he says now most of the time is it's about the resistance exercise. It's not about how much protein. And certainly above 1.6 grams per kilogram, there is no effect.
Right.
Maybe a little if you go less than that, but it's hard to suss it out. Am I just imagining that? Or?
No, and I'm quite surprised because there's a lot of questions in nutrition that are impossible to answer, if not incredibly difficult. Yeah. If you want to see who lives or dies, you can't prove that unequivocally. Muscle building isn't that bad. And this part I don't know. What's the proper duration of time? 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 6 months? You know, at what level have you proved your point that they did or didn't make or lose muscle? But it's not 10 years and it's not 5 years. If you were going to be weaker or stronger, I think you would know in 4 weeks or 8 weeks. I'm really interested in the folks who are concerned about getting enough protein, and so they are making sure they get a protein shake and a protein bar and 2 breasts of chicken and the stuff. It's like, wait, you're already trained and you're already working out, doing well. What is it that you're trying to achieve here? And they're just trying to maintain. And you look and you see how much protein they're getting. It's quite a bit. Okay, wait a sec, the dogs are distracting me. My frustration in that field is I haven't seen a whole lot of studies that carry them out to 4 to 8 weeks where they're stronger, but Stu Phillips has, and some of those studies that I've seen summarized, or what you were speaking to, is whether it was animal protein or plant protein or the amount. So Stu definitely told me at one point, he said, this is one thing that I have changed my tone on. It doesn't matter if it's
animal
plant
versus plant
or animal. You just got to get enough. And enough is maybe as high as 1.6 grams, which would be double the RDA. But if you have people working out hard enough to be trying to build muscle, they're getting that with food, without the protein bar and the protein powder and the protein supplements. So if you are an athlete, you're probably getting 3,000 calories a day. And a lot of the data that we see is based on Americans getting 2,000 calories a day. That's already 50%.
It's already accounted for.
More calories.
Doesn't
right
this
there.
go back to the wisdom of the ages? Stay trim, lose some weight, and exercise, and then everything happens naturally. You have lower kilograms of body weight, and you have more calorie consumption, so you end up with in the optimal range of protein consumption if you eat a balanced diet.
It's not a limiting factor.
Talk about the unexpected side effects of putting protein in everything. I brought some cereal for you here.
Come here.
So, you know, Kashi is kind of a classic cereal.
Yeah.
But now they've added protein to it. And they do that with Wheaties and Cheerios. And newfangled cereals are coming out like Magic Spoon, high in fiber. And the number one ingredient is pea protein isolate. And then tapioca starch. So is this based on, you know, children evolved to eat pea protein isolate for millions of years, and so this is considered the healthiest way to do it? What trade-offs are you making? Because the protein isolates taste terrible, right? So you got to add sugar and flavoring,
Yes.
and then you get less fiber. Tell me.
Animal foods don't have carbs. They really just have protein and fat. So if you're going to get an animal source food, because of the lower calories from 0 carbs, it's going to be higher protein. That means you get no carbs and no fiber and a lot of the things that come with that.
Phytochemicals and...
Yeah, the phyto just means plant, so phytochemicals just means chemicals in plants. And generally that area has to do with cool chemical compounds in foods that we don't understand yet, for which we do not have a recommended daily allowance. So we have that for vitamins, we have it for minerals. Mm-hmm. There's hundreds of other things that look interesting, but nobody's been able to take the time to figure out the dose and the source for a particular health outcome. So we just umbrella term phytochemicals. But yeah, so when you're taking these protein isolates, which aren't food, so they don't taste good, to make them taste good, you add things like sugar and fat to them. I mean, this goes back to the days of the low-fat craze when people said, oh my God, it's the fat that's killing us. And when they took the fat out, that's when the sugar got added.
Isn't it the same thing? I lived through the whole low-fat craze. I mean, it didn't come from the dietary guidelines like people want to say or anything like that.
It did not.
And we just, somehow Americans got obsessed with low-fat.
Right.
And now somehow Americans are obsessed with protein.
Yeah, and then after getting obsessed with low fat and getting into sugar, sugar was a problem. So they said, great, well, we have lots of sugar substitutes. Let's give you sucralose and aspartame and saccharin. And again, we're moving farther away from food. So as you go to more and more protein and making it not food, but isolates and supplements, it's less food. So for it to be palatable and taste good, you have to add stuff, which is the wrong direction.
So I got an example. Let's see how you reflect on this. Maybe you already know about it. RX bars.
I've seen those.
Yeah, they put the ingredients right on the front. 3 egg whites, 14 peanuts, 2 dates. I looked at the ingredients. They have natural flavors in there, but really they're fairly natural ingredients. So the guy who started this with $10,000, 4 years later, he sold it to Kellogg for $600 million. You can get rich with protein bars. So he had a non-compete. So he couldn't compete for a while. But after the non-compete expired, he said, well, now I want to do bars again because $600 million is not enough. Or something. And how do I create the bar that has the highest protein per calorie? And so he got together with Peter Attia as the chief science officer and investor, and Andrew Huberman, who likes to promote these things. And they came up with the David bar. And I'm telling you, they got rid of egg whites, peanuts, and dates and all that, because to hit those protein levels, they gotta, I can't recognize these ingredients, but there must be, glycerin, allulose, tapioca starch, blah, 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 milk protein isolate, collagen, whey protein concentrate.
Woof!
It's like, okay.
Protein.
We've gone full ultra-processed foods in order to get that little bit of extra protein in the protein bars so they get another.
For people wondering, what is that ingredient EPG? It's a chemically modified vegetable oil called esterified propoxylated glycerol. The chemical modification makes it so the body can only digest about 8% of it, and the rest passes through without adding calories. For people who lived through the 90s, like I did, this is like next-gen Olestra.
One of the 90s most infamous health food innovations was Olestra, a fat substitute that promised to let us all eat as many potato chips as we wanted, without wreaking havoc on our waistlines. Because in the good old US of A, don't make us choose between Doritos and buns of steel. Olestra, the miracle food product that became a pop culture punchline in less than a year.
The problem with Olestra is its melting point was low enough that it created anal leakage. Not a great selling point for the brand. The chemical alterations used in making EPG increased the saturation of the fat and therefore the melting point. So the papers I read about it said it probably won't cause anal leakage for you unless you eat too much of it. David raised $75 million and bought Epigi, the makers of EPG, who have several patents on the chemical. Then they cut off all other companies who were incorporating it into their products. Like most new chemicals, we won't know what the long-term effect is on our bodies for probably 10 years or more. But the moral of the story is, if you want to get insanely rich, invent an ultra-processed food, and David bars take ultra-processing to the next level.
Can I see, so how many calories and how much protein? Okay, so you're now getting 150 calories. So if you eat 2,000 calories a day, you're nudging up towards 10% of your calories, and you're getting 28 grams of protein. So you're getting, basically half your protein needs for the day with less than 10% of your calories.
Yeah.
And then you're eating food the rest of the day. Oh my God. Yeah. We're just moving farther and farther away from food at a time when we need to be going the exact opposite direction. So the whole ultra-processed food thing is really a hot topic in the nutrition world right now.
So I'll interject for just a second to say something Christopher probably can't say because he's a Stanford professor, and probably wouldn't say because he's so nice a guy. And that is, it's probably right to wonder if we've been scammed, and that's the reason why we have such catastrophically bad health in America. But we identified the wrong scammers. These are your scammers. They're becoming incredibly rich, selling you ultra-processed candy bars, masquerading as health food by leveraging the latest American health obsession. It's an obsession they helped create by calling the recommendations made by scientists around the world a joke. But somehow we Americans believed them and not the scientists, whereas other healthy countries went the other way.
And you served on the Dietary Guidelines Committee.
Yes.
With Didi Tobias, who I interviewed.
Love her.
Yeah, she's great. And a whole panel of experts. I read the report, 450 pages. It's a lot. It looked like the conclusions were eat more beans, peas, and lentils. Eat less meat, poultry, or beef, poultry, and eggs.
Yes.
Avoid added sugars, saturated fat, and sodium. Weren't those the big takeaways?
Those are the big takeaways, and a lot of those are consistent with the past. So we've always said eat less added sugar, eat less sodium, eat more vegetables. So a couple interesting things that I was really pleased with from participating in this Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, which produces an advisory which doesn't become the dietary guidelines. It's advisory material for the USDA and Health and Human Services. So we don't know if that'll actually change the dietary guidelines for Americans.
It may not anymore,
but it is a scientific document backed with 20 scientists who worked for 2 years reviewing the literature. And so let me do the beans, peas, and lentils thing, because this was fun for us. So one of the many topics, so we tried to answer 60 questions in this advisory committee over the 2 years, meeting as often as we did. And some of the questions had multiple sub-questions. And everybody of the 20, we all got to lead different sections of it. So myself and Deanna Holscher from Texas got charged with the food sources of saturated fat. They've always done saturated fat. And a question came up, well, if you were going to tell somebody to get less saturated fat instead of just saying that, which foods would you say? Because that might have an impact that's more practical than just saying lowering saturated fat. I was very excited about this question, and it started out being, so what are the main sources? And it's meat and dairy and tropical oils. Those are the 3 main sources. And for this review committee that we were working on, we had to be very specific about something called PICO. And PICO is an acronym for the population, the intervention, the comparison, the outcome, and the time. And so we had to do an extensive search for every single question, and we had to be very specific about all those things. And so if you just focus on the intervention part, these would be studies that looked at meat or dairy or tropical oils. And the comparisons were meat or dairy at a lower fat level. So for milk, just think of the obvious ones. We've got low fat milk and skim milk, right? For meat, we've got regular meat and lean meat. Or it could be a different food. It could be beef versus chicken, beef versus fish, beef versus eggs. The other comparators were the plant foods. So you could have beans, peas, and lentils. You could have vegetables. You could have grains. And so when you're trying to ask this one question about food sources of saturated fat, it ended up being 30 questions because we had 3 types of interventions or sources. We had multiple comparisons that you could switch it out for. And we were supposed to look at kids and adults and elderly. It was pretty consistent that when you switched out some kind of animal food for another source of animal food with less saturated fat, there wasn't much difference. You didn't really see an impact going from whole fat milk to skim, from regular beef to lean beef. You saw it when you went from the animal food to the beans, peas, and lentils separate, or the vegetables, the grains. And to me, the answer is obvious. So not only do those have less saturated fat, they have more fiber. And in the nutrition world, it makes sense that initially you would avoid that. You'd say, oh, this is too confusing. Now I don't know if it was the saturated fat or the fiber that made a difference. That's why I want to stick in sort of in one lane, one category. But in practical terms, that's what you get when you switch food. And so you're handcuffing yourself if you're saying, I'm not going to do that comparison because now I don't know if it's the lower saturated fat or the higher fiber. And the other part of the practical question is, who cares? If you made the switch and it was lower in saturated fat and higher in fiber, that's what you'd get. If you were a physician advising a patient, you wouldn't say, now make sure that when you lower that saturated fat, that you add something back so that you know it was the thing, not the other thing. You'd say, hey, I have a practical idea for you. Why don't you eat a little less meat and try some more beans, peas, and lentils? And when we did that, it looked very consistently better. 2 other things happened. So at the end of the dietary guidelines for Americans, there are some patterns of a US healthy diet, a Mediterranean healthy diet, and a vegetarian healthy diet that have been promoted for the last 2 rounds of the dietary guidelines. And at every level of calories, from 1,000 to 3,000, if you look at this table, they say how many servings of every kind of food you need. And they look at this saying, okay, now, what would you need for servings to be able to get all the vitamins, all the minerals, and everything else you need? There was a group that looked specifically at those. It wasn't my subcommittee, it was another subcommittee. They looked specifically at those thinking, would you compromise anything if you got rid of some meat and added beans, peas, and lentils? And the conclusion was no. One of the things we found is, whereas many of the other patterns said low-fat dairy is part of this, when we looked at different populations, think how much of the world is lactose intolerant, we actually pulled the dairy out of this statement and said, and the pattern doesn't actually need to have dairy. It could for some people, but it doesn't really have to.
But I hear the dietary guidelines have been disproven because the Wall Street Journal just ran an editorial from Nina Teicholz, and she said the fatal flaw in the dietary guidelines is it focuses on plant proteins which are inferior.
Yeah. Poor Nina. I don't understand where she's coming from. There's so much data.
It just seems like she gets really upset with me when I say this, but it just feels like she's laundering meat industry talking points.
Yeah, I don't understand the incentive for it. Because of the saturated fat, because of the lack of fiber, because of the amount of meat that gets consumed in the US. If you see a global graphic of this, it's somewhat terrifying.
I know, it's terrifying.
One of the highest consuming countries in the world. So my frustration is there's so much room to cut back. So I'm totally supportive of an all plant-based diet, but you don't have to be all plant-based. You don't have to be vegan. It's just the fact that it's this obscene amount of meat that we're eating that leads to these.
Do you get discouraged when you see an article like that in the Wall Street Journal?
From Nina, yes, drives me crazy. And then trying to discuss this with her, she actually knows enough about the science to use terms that sound plausible, but the data aren't there
at all
to back it up. And it's like a shouting match of, yes, this is plausible, this happens. No, if you were the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee and you had 2 years and 20 people to work on it, you would say beans, peas, and lentils. You know, where are you getting your data?
You know, I interviewed Dee Dee. She wouldn't talk about the dietary guidelines because it was still actively going on. Yeah. So I just talked to her about epidemiology. But I did ask her about Nina's book. And she was so emotional about it. She made this gesture.
I remember thinking, what science are they reading?
What science are people reading where they think meat and saturated fat are healthy?
Yeah.
I have never seen that science.
So, I mean, it totally parallels this bizarre seed oil thing that's going on right now.
Yeah, another American obsession. I know it drives you crazy that you see editorials like that in the Wall Street Journal. But fortunately, it's behind a paywall. Their distribution is somewhat limited and so on. But here's what's at the grocery store checkout stand, face out.
Aha, there we go.
Does that cheer you up?
Superfoods, yes.
You feeling better now?
I feel much better now, yeah.
And it's a pretty credible brand, National Geographic.
National Geographic, which I think usually does a good job.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
This has been great fun.
Yeah, it's been
Thanks.
awesome.
So, Chris, you say, do tell on where you stand on protein powders because your buddy Simon Hill recommends them. I do have the highest regard for Simon, and he's a muscular, healthy guy with a great body. I've always wanted to get a pic of him holding up Michelle or Tony with one arm. I'm personally suspicious of protein powders because, to my knowledge, we don't have long-term data on them, and they are a refined food. Simon rightly points out that we have many studies, such as from the Nurses' Health Study, that show more plant protein is generally positive for longevity. But to my knowledge, those studies don't capture protein powder consumption, just protein from food. I was also suspicious of oils for a very long time because they're stripped of protein and fiber. But we do have long-term studies on them showing how healthy they are. So maybe the same thing will turn out to be true of plant protein powders. I just don't know. But my bigger point is Simon is almost a unicorn. He's a lean vegan weightlifting machine who probably represents 0.1% of Americans. The majority of Americans are overweight or obese. They're not exercising, and they're calculating their protein needs by total body weight, including fat mass. And they're getting ultra-processed protein supplements, artificially flavored and sweetened, and not eating much that looks like the guidelines from healthy countries. Doesn't that sound like the supplement industry cashing in? Remember the influencer we saw drinking raw milk with RFK? He was using the White House to promote the supplements he sells, based on things like beef trachea and eggshell membranes. And how is collagen a whole real food? By the way, Paul's education is in psychiatry, so he would know the natural human reaction to seeing an ingredient like trachea in a supplement that you don't normally get in your diet is to think, oh, I don't get trachea in my diet. Maybe I should step up and pay $60 a pound for Paul's collagen. But the market for trachea is mainly pet food, like dog chews. I see you can buy 2 pounds mixed with gullet, which is the esophagus, for about $2.50 a pound if you want a cheaper source. Whenever I mention eating pet food, though, people react saying, "Oh, that's disgusting. How can you even say that?" But my mom and I were so poor when I was elementary school age, we ate tons of dog food. It's much healthier than what we feed kids. No one would ever give their dog Coca-Cola. While other kids got to eat junk food, this is what I had. Why wouldn't I eat that? I'm not a trachea researcher, but my weak understanding is there was some research on it in the 70s and 80s, and then it faded because it seemed to be a nothing burger. I hope Paul isn't just throwing this in his supplements because it's a cheap ingredient. Sounds a lot like another Liver King scam, doesn't it? Anyway, I'll end on what I think is such amazing news. Several countries have demonstrated they can flatten their obesity curves, bend them back down, or maintain impressively low levels via a simple diet their populations love. Their nutrition scientists have done all the work, and their teachers and public health officials have become good at teaching it to their populations. All that pro-science wisdom is simple and free to us. It's a gift, and they've shown that it works in modern industrial populations. What's fascinating is how these diets have evolved over thousands of years. I know this because I read very old diet books, this one from 1655, written by Thomas Moffat, doctor in physic. They didn't know what caused scurvy, beriberi, and pellagra, or the plague. They didn't know about protein. What they did know is eating the widest variety of foods, including some animals not raised in stalls, improved your odds of surviving them all. When the PhD nutrition scientist Harriet Chick formulated the British rations for World War I, she made them out of sprouted beans, peas, and lentils. I kid you not. And she saved a lot of British troops from pellagra, beriberi, and scurvy. Just think about how wonderful it would be if, by trusting science, it would save some of us from having to stab ourselves once a week with an expensive drug that has side effects to lose weight. Instead, we learn to love the time-tested foods that are so delicious in France and Italy. What? You're still here after 50-some-odd minutes? Thank you so much. Just think of all the good you and I can do by getting this message out.